Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The apartment was silent except for the slow tick of a wall clock that had stopped meaning anything weeks ago. Jack Callahan sat on the edge of a worn couch, his calloused hands hanging between his knees, staring at nothing. The evening light filtered through dusty blinds, painting long shadows across empty walls where family photos once hung. At 53 years old, he looked older, his face carved by more than time, by wars both foreign and domestic, by losses that had no medals attached to them. Beside him, a German shepherd named Atlas lay with his massive head resting on Jack's boot. The dog's amber eyes never left his master's face, reading the pain there with an understanding that went beyond words. Jack had survived firefights in Kandahar. He'd led men through ambushes and brought them home. But he hadn't been able to save Margaret from the cancer that took her in 6 brutal months. He hadn't been able to save his logistics business when his partner embezzled everything and vanished. The war had taken his youth, but peace had taken everything else. Now the eviction notice sat on the coffee table like a final judgment. 30 days. Atlas shifted, pressing closer, and Jack's hand moved automatically to the dog's neck, fingers finding comfort in warm fur and steady heartbeat. "Just you and me now, boy," he whispered into the gathering darkness. The laptop screen glowed in the dim room as Jack searched for the cheapest dog food he could afford. Atlas had never missed a meal, not once, not even when Jack went without. That's what you did for loyalty like his. His finger slipped on the trackpad, a misclick that opened a strange listing he hadn't meant to see. 1922 Pullman rail car, scrap value only, must remove from property, $3,200 OBO. The photos showed a massive steel hulk, consumed by rust and time, sitting in overgrown weeds somewhere deep in rural North Carolina. Windows broken, paint gone, a forgotten piece of history that the world had discarded. Jack stared at it for a long time. To anyone else, it was worthless junk. To Jack Callahan, a man who had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go, it looked like distance. It looked like shelter. It looked like one last mission when all other orders had ceased. He didn't pray anymore, but sitting there in the darkness with Atlas breathing steadily beside him, Jack made a decision. Not from hope, from something older and more stubborn, the soldier's refusal to surrender, even when retreat makes sense. Over the next 2 weeks, Jack sold everything. The furniture went first, then the kitchen appliances, the television, tools he'd collected over decades. He kept Margaret's wedding ring. Couldn't bring himself to let that go. But her other jewelry, the pieces she'd loved, went to a pawn shop where a disinterested clerk weighed them like they meant nothing. Each transaction felt like peeling away layers of a life that no longer fit. He kept only what mattered: his military duffel bag, his service medals still in their case, a framed photograph of Margaret on their wedding day, and Atlas's stainless steel food bowl, the one with his name engraved on the side. The rail car cost $3,000. Transportation cost another $1,200. Jack counted out the cash with hands that didn't shake, even though he was buying either salvation or the biggest mistake of his life. There was no way to know which until it was too late to turn back. Atlas watched it all with patient eyes, never questioning, always trusting, always trusting. The transport truck arrived on a cold October morning in the mountains of North Carolina, its diesel engine rumbling through pine-scented air. Jack had purchased 3 acres of isolated woodland for almost nothing, land nobody wanted, too remote for development, too steep for farming, perfect for disappearing. The truck driver was a weathered man who asked no questions, just worked the hydraulics and chains with practiced efficiency. The rail car groaned and shrieked as it was lowered onto the clearing Jack had barely managed to prepare. When the massive steel body finally settled onto concrete blocks with a thunderous boom, the driver collected his payment and left without ceremony.
Silence returned like a held breath released. Jack stood there with Atlas at his side, staring at what he'd done. The railcar looked worse in person, much worse. The photographs had been merciful. Rust had eaten through panels, the roof sagged in places. Inside, mold bloomed in dark corners, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Broken glass crunched under his boots. Water damage had warped the fine wood that had once been elegant. It looked like a steel coffin, abandoned by time and purpose. Doubt hit Jack harder than any mortar round ever had. What was he doing? What kind of desperate foolishness had brought him to this god-forsaken mountainside with a rotting train car and a dog, throwing away the last of his money on a fantasy that a broken man could somehow build something from ruin? He sat down heavily on a rock, head in his hands. Atlas moved close, pressing his solid weight against Jack's leg. The dog's eyes were steady, calm, completely without judgment. Just presence, just loyalty, just love that asked for nothing in return. "Yeah," Jack said quietly, his voice rough. "We've been in worse spots, haven't we, boy?" The dog's tail thumped once against the ground.
Morning changed everything. Jack woke in his sleeping bag on the steel floor as dawn light filtered through broken windows. His back ached, his breath misted in the cold air. But something had shifted in the night. Some internal compass had found true north again. He didn't retreat. He got to work. Starting with the simplest tasks, Jack began cleaning, sweeping out debris, scrubbing away years of neglect, fighting rust like it was an enemy position, slowly, methodically, with the discipline the army had beaten into him until it became part of his DNA. And then, while prying up a section of rotted flooring, his crowbar hit something solid. A metal box hidden beneath the floor panels. Jack's heart hammered as he worked it free. The box was old, locked, heavy. He forced it open with tools from his duffel, and inside found something impossible, his grandfather's tool chest. Thomas Callahan had been a railroad man, a builder who'd worked these very mountains in the 1940s. Jack had heard stories but never seen this chest, thought lost decades ago. Inside were hand tools worn smooth by use, carefully maintained, and beneath them a leather journal filled with his grandfather's neat handwriting. Jack's hands trembled as he opened it. "A home isn't walls," the first page read. "It's what you protect with effort. What you build with your hands becomes part of your soul. Don't ever forget, you come from builders, Jack. Act like it." Tears blurred his vision. He didn't know how the chest had ended up here, in this specific rail car, waiting for him. Coincidence seemed too small a word. Fate seemed too grand. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Build, protect, continue. Atlas sat beside him, patient and solid, as Jack wiped his eyes and opened the journal to the first diagram. The work became everything. Jack rose with the sun and worked until darkness forced him to stop. Using his grandfather's tools and the journal's wisdom, he began truly restoring the rail car. He patched floors with reclaimed lumber, replaced broken windows with salvaged glass, installed a small wood stove he'd found at a rural auction for almost nothing. Each repair was a battle won. Each improvement restored more than metal. It restored purpose. His hands, idle for so long, remembered their strength. His mind, clouded by grief and loss, found clarity in problems that had solutions. Cut this board, seal that seam, level this frame. Atlas supervised everything, his presence a constant comfort. The dog explored the woods, chased squirrels, but always returned, always checking on Jack with those intelligent amber eyes. Weeks passed. The railcar slowly transformed. It was Atlas who found them first. The dog had wandered down an overgrown trail one afternoon, following scents only he could detect. Jack heard voices and followed, emerging into a small clearing where a woman was hanging laundry while a young boy played nearby. Emily Parker looked up, startled, her hand moving protectively toward her son. But Atlas, tail wagging, approached with such gentle friendliness that her fear dissolved into cautious curiosity. "I'm sorry," Jack said quickly, keeping his distance. "He's friendly. I'm your neighbor, I guess. Just moved into the old rail car up the hill." Emily's eyes widened. "The Pullman? We thought that was still abandoned." "It was," Jack said. "I'm working on it." The boy, Noah, Jack would learn, stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of 10-year-olds everywhere. "You live in a train? A real train?" Despite everything, Jack smiled. "Not much of one yet, but yeah." That first meeting was awkward, brief, but Noah's fascination was genuine, and children have a way of seeing past the walls adults build. The next day, the boy appeared at the rail car with a thermos of soup from his mother and 100 questions. Jack found himself answering. And then Noah started helping, holding boards, fetching tools, learning. Emily would come by with food, with quilts, with conversation that Jack hadn't realized he'd been starving for. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't alone. Word spread in the quiet way of rural communities. An old carpenter named Walter Hayes appeared one morning with a truck full of surplus lumber. "Heard you might need this," was all he said. A family from down the mountain brought canned goods in a propane heater. Others came with small offerings. Kindness following curiosity, connection growing in the space where isolation had been. The lonely clearing came alive. Jack had sought distance but found community instead. The rail car was no longer isolation, it was becoming something else, something better. The storm came in November with savage intensity. Rain turned the mountain into a roaring cascade of water. The creek that ran behind Emily's property swelled into a violent torrent, and in the chaos and darkness, Noah went missing. Emily's scream brought Jack running. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. The soldier returned, calm, focused, deadly serious. He grabbed rope from the rail car, secured one end to a tree, and fashioned a harness for Atlas. "Find him, boy," Jack commanded, and the German shepherd plunged into the darkness without hesitation. Jack followed the rope through rain that struck like nails, through water that tried to sweep him away. Atlas was ahead, his powerful body fighting the current, following some sense that humans had long ago lost. And there, caught against a fallen tree, was Noah, barely conscious, terrified. Atlas reached him first, his massive body providing an anchor. Jack arrived seconds later, securing the boy to the rope, speaking calm words that couldn't be heard over the storm, but were felt nonetheless. Together, man and dog brought Noah back to solid ground, to his mother's arms, to safety. After that night, everything changed. The community no longer saw Jack as a strange outsider living in a rusted train car. They saw him as a protector, as someone who ran toward danger when others ran away, as exactly what he'd always been, a soldier who kept his oath. The rail car earned a name, spoken with respect, Hopeline Station, a place where broken paths met safety. But Jack carried a different weight now. Saving Noah had wakened his deepest guilt. Ethan, his own son, estranged for nearly 5 years. Years of missed calls, unspoken words, anger that had hardened into silence. Emily saw it in him one evening as they sat by the wood stove. "You saved my son," she said gently. "Who's going to save you from whatever you're carrying?" Jack stared at his hands for a long time. Then, with those same hands that had built and fought and rescued, he wrote a letter to Ethan. Not excuses, not justifications, just truth. I failed you as a father. I failed your mother. I failed myself. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I haven't earned it, but I want you to know I'm trying to be someone worth knowing again. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'll always be here." He mailed it without expectation. 3 weeks later, on a cold December afternoon, Atlas suddenly raised his head from where he'd been sleeping by the stove. His ears pricked forward, a low whine escaped him. Not alarm, but recognition. Jack looked up to see a figure emerging from the tree line. Tall, lean, wearing a familiar Marine's jacket. Ethan. Jack stood slowly, his heart hammering, words dying in his throat. 5 years of silence stood between them like a canyon too wide to cross. Then Atlas moved. The dog crossed the distance in powerful strides and nearly bowled Ethan over with joy, tail whipping back and forth, a sound between a whine and a cry of pure recognition. Ethan dropped to his knees, burying his face in the dog's fur, and Jack saw his son's shoulder shake. What men struggled to say, loyalty said in seconds. Jack walked forward. "Ethan." His son looked up, eyes red. "Dad." They stood there, 2 warriors marked by different wars, separated by pride and pain and time. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice breaking, "for everything, for not being there, for—" "I got your letter," Ethan interrupted. "I've read it every day since it came." The space between them felt impossible and small at the same time. "I don't know how to fix this," Jack admitted. Ethan looked at the rail car, at the careful restoration, at the life his father had built from literal rust and ruin. "Maybe we just start," he said quietly, "like you did here." Atlas, still pressed between them, looked from father to son with satisfied eyes. The weeks that followed were not easy. Rebuilding trust never is. But through shared work, repairing the rail car's roof, installing proper insulation, building a small porch, father and son began to talk, really talk, about Margaret's death and how they'd each handled it badly, about expectations and failures, about the man Jack had been and the man he was trying to become. Apologies were spoken, understanding replaced resentment. The past loosened its grip, one honest conversation at a time. On Christmas Eve, Hopeline Station glowed with lights Emily and Noah had helped string. The community gathered, Walter with his quiet wisdom, families Jack barely knew but who'd become neighbors, and Ethan, who stayed close to his father like he was relearning how. Jack stood on the small porch, watching Atlas play with Noah in the light snow that had begun to fall. Emily handed him coffee, smiling. Ethan stood beside him, and for the first time in years, put his hand on Jack's shoulder. The rail car stood solid and warm against the winter night, no longer a ruin, but a home. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. "You did this, Dad. You really did this." Jack thought about the journey that had brought him here, the losses that had broken him, the desperation that had driven him to buy a worthless piece of scrap metal, the work that had saved him, the dog who had never abandoned him, the community that had embraced him, the son who had come home.
"No," Jack said, looking down at Atlas, who gazed back with those steady amber eyes. "We did this." The dog's tail thumped against the porch. As winter settled over the mountains, Jack Callahan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The war inside him, the one that had raged longer than any combat tour, was finally over. He hadn't just rebuilt a rail car. He had rebuilt a life. From rust and ruin and grief, he had built something strong and beautiful. Because that's what builders do. That's what soldiers do when the last mission is the hardest one, coming home to yourself. And he had done it with a loyal heart that never left his side. Hopeline Station stood as proof that even the most broken among us can be restored. That second chances are real, that loyalty, whether from a faithful dog, a caring community, or a forgiving son, is the strongest foundation anyone can build on. Jack had learned what his grandfather knew all along. A home isn't walls, it's what you protect with effort. What you build with your hands becomes part of your soul. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to keep building one day at a time until the rust falls away and something beautiful remains. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Every week, we bring you true stories of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between veterans and their faithful companions. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because these stories matter, and so do the quiet heroes who live them. Thank you for being part of our community.